Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. We have our attorney and government affairs director, Brian Blem, joining us today, along with our investigator, Kimberly Burleson. We will be talking to you today about the industrial military complex, CISA, Center for Informational Security Agency, and States United, and how these governmental agencies and these nonprofits partner together to create a system that is not always in the best interests of the people. Welcome, Brian and Kimberly.
Hello, how are you
Good
doing?
good evening.
Thank you for having me, by God, and for doing this. And so, I just want to sort of share sort of at least my thoughts into what this is and what we're intending to do here today. I think is somewhat of a broad overview. And the way I look at it is, and I don't talk like most people, but the way I look at it is that what's been taking place in the United States, especially during the 20th century, you look at the huge growth in the military industrial complex, other industrial complexes like the medical industrial complex, and things of that nature in the United States. And so some would liken that to a form of fascism, but basically it's the birth. The United States right now is trying to create a system that is autocratic in nature, right? And what is an autocracy? An autocracy is a government that has the ability to replicate itself over time and maintain itself in power over time. And so if you look at an autocracy, there are always dictatorships, but it's simply a government that has the ability to ensure that it has the ability to stay in power in the future, regardless of what anybody else wants. And I think that's what especially the national security state began doing after it lost the election in 2016 to President Donald Trump. So I'm looking at this sort of from this abstract philosophical point of view. And so there are going to be future shows that branch off of this one show because the topic is so deep. We'll do a segment with we'll have Chris Hansel, our technology expert, on board to talk about technology and how that's being used in the current system to create this autocratic system of government. But you've got a whole bunch of different branches of this river that will flow off, and we'll do individual shows on so that we can get more in depth as opposed to covering it in just a broad overview. But yeah.
So, Brian, what happened in late 2015 leading up to the election of Donald Trump and as we moved into 16 as far as the perpetration of this Russia narrative?
Well, John McCain, when he was running in the primary against Donald Trump, it's very well known that John McCain was a war hawk, a lover of the national security state. He was he was raised in an era somewhat similar to the era we were all raised in, and that was this anti-communism, right? We had the Soviet Union, the evil Soviet Union, that had this very internationalistic ideology, because communism, seeks to unite the workers en masse of the entire world so that it can create this utopian system. It doesn't work with just one country. And so the Union Soviet Socialist Republics, when it's created coming out of World War One, becomes this very internationalistic country that then, thinks it needs to push its ideology into neighboring countries so that it can dominate the entire world and unite the workers of the world. And so, basically, at the end of World War II, we were allied with the Soviet Union during World War II. Some would say we were a pretty shitty ally because we allied with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. But then what we did was we allowed Nazi Germany to invade the deep into the heartland of Russia, where we could have helped them. And we, our goal, public policy, international foreign policy wise, was to weaken both the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany, especially weaken the Soviet Union coming out of World War II. So we allowed the Nazis to go into the heartland of the Soviet Union, run amok, and as sort of a defensive way of weakening the Soviet Union coming out of World War II. So coming out of World War II, the United States has very, very shitty relationship with the Union Soviet Socialist Republic, and for very good reason. And so uh, the Cold War then develops, and we become this sort of we create this theory known as the domino theory, right? Where the belief is, if South Vietnam falls, then Laos and Cambodia will fall, right? If Chile falls to the communists, then Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, all of those southern South America countries will fall to communism. And so we had to fight them in all of these different countries, like in El Salvador, and Honduras with the Contras and against the Sandinistas. And so it was this the United States was actually actively engaged in war with the Soviet Union around the world. It just wasn't the direct fighting between Soviet forces and US forces. We were using these surrogates to do it. And so this was what was known as the Cold War, right? We're all raised, we see all the bomb shelters and the desks. You'd hide under your desk in case of a nuclear attack, right? Nobody wants that. Nobody wants any of that. But what we're seeing now coming out of that Cold War is the national security state that had grown so large and complex. They love power, right? They think they are right. They are a bunch of people. Have you ever seen that show, American Dad, or something like that? It's a cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody ever seen that? Right. The guy works for the CIA. He's a CIA and he's got an alien in his home. And the guy's a complete fucking moron. And I'm not saying people in the Central Intelligence Agency are complete morons, but he is the epitome of patriotism, right? He's a patriot. He loves America and will do everything necessary to ensure that America continues. And so that's sort of what we're seeing here is this national security state that believes that America should continue, not necessarily the US Constitution should continue. And so that's the rub. That's where the problem is. And that's why I know Kim has a lot more knowledge about Susan Spalding than I will ever possess in my little brain. But that's why Susan Spalding, when she started talking to the courts, began saying things like, we have to protect the institution, right? The institution is different than the underlying law that creates and governs that institution, which is, of course, known as either the Constitution of the United States or the Constitution of Alaska or Arizona or New Hampshire or whatever the case may be. And so it becomes a focus on protecting the institution so that it survives. But really, what the national security state is doing is it's protecting itself as an institution. And so I don't know if any of that makes sense or not.
No, absolutely. And, it's interesting you say that because in the times we're living in, sometimes it's hard to tell what side people are on and certain issues. And for me, it kind of goes down to, are they putting the institution first or the Constitution first, right?
Yeah.
And that falls right in line with what you're saying. There are certain actors within our government, Stephen Richer was one of them, that I believe was willing to do whatever it took to protect the institution, even at the expense of the Constitution, right?
I
And
agree.
so
I agree 100%.
So if we think about it from that term, that's who these people are, right? It's like I don't know if you've ever seen any of the episodes of Scandal, right? But it's this television show, and unfortunately, it actually has a lot of lifelike parallels. And this is just a strike force team of undercover operatives, and their whole job is just to prop up the institution. They have to keep the institution propped up because if the people lose trust in the institution, their whole system collapses, right? and
Right.
and so you had brought up Susan Spalding. So after all of those Russia scandals where they tried to convince the American people that Trump colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election, we started seeing more and more of Susan Spalding on the scene. Do you want to talk a little bit, Kimberly, about, her Kremlin report and what happened, and how Susan Spalding kind of made her way into our elections and into our judiciary?
Oh yeah, that's a real interesting story. And it's funny that you bring up defending institutions because that's what she ended up renaming her organization at CSIS was defending democratic institutions. Um, so when she wrote Beyond the Ballot, she used that as a launching pad, but really her whole story starts back in about 2016 when she started. She had a Stanford speech and she said she was training judges and talking to judges in January of 2016. When she left DHS, excuse me, when she left DHS in January 2017 after Trump was inaugurated, she said that she had a red team. That red team put out a report and had, she says, a list, and John Hamre jumped on board of going after the judiciary because nobody else was doing that, quote unquote. Nobody else was doing that.
So what did she specifically do, Kimberly, when it
You
came
Maybe
to
nobody
going?
else was doing that because they're not supposed to. It's supposed to be an independent judiciary. But I digress, and
No, but
I
you're right. For the branch of government that is supposed to be not influenced, they were totally influenced by Susan Spalding. And it's probably good to show the slide on what her history was before she even got to the Kremlin report. And that was she started at the Central Intelligence Agency.
So
And
what you're saying, Kimberly, is she was a CIA operative who eventually gained extraordinary power over our
yes.
judiciary system. Do you want to walk us through kind of this whole path? And wasn't she also involved in the Senate Select Committee, and the House Committee and people like that during this Russia investigation? So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, she was part of the select committee in intelligence. She was the attorney. She was on the select committee, and a lot of the players that she is going through with the censorship complex and the judiciary targeting them are players that she's been dealing with for years. So like Mark Warner, he's on the select committee, the intelligence committee, and he's the one that had at the time that he nominated her for MPPD, the head of MPPD at the time, which was pre-CISA, he had said he'd known her for 30 years and, had dinner with her and, their best bud and their kids hung out and, that kind of thing. And so when her career was all about gaining more and more information, and now she's got a foot into any organization that she wants to go into. And so if she comes to a judge and says, well, I have credible information that Russia's going to be coming after you, they're going to believe her because she is from CIA, because she is connected to the intelligence community so well. And when she started her reporting she started this back in January 2016, if you believe that speech that she said. And she started training judges. Her first presentation to them was in February 2018. That was way before the Arizona task force was even thought about. And then the National Center for State Courts came on board. She brought them
Well,
on board.
let's talk about that, Kimberly, if you don't mind me interrupting.
No,
So,
good.
so a lot of people may not even know much about the Disinformation Task Force. Now, Suzanne Spalding, she did a presentation in DC, I believe it was, right? Somewhere, it
Hmm.
was somewhere back east to the Supreme Court justice, the chief justices and the directors of the courts all across the US, right? And
Yeah.
that's where she kind of rolled out this whole idea of how Russia was going to destroy our judiciary system, the way that they tried to destroy the elections through Donald Trump. Um, can you tell people a little bit about what this task force is and maybe some of the players and what it was commissioned to do?
Well, the commission was, they convinced David Byers to go back and talk to from reading through all the information, it looks like the Arizona Bar or the America Bar Association sent, or the Arizona Bar Association sent David Byers to this meeting, not the Chief Justice at the time, because Brutinel was not the Chief Justice at the time. So he goes, he listens to this presentation, comes back and reports back to the bar, and they said, "Oh yeah, we have to do something." And so by this time, they get Justice Brutinel in and they establish the task force. The whole deal with the task force was to um, see if there was an issue with disinformation and misinformation and malinformation affecting the courts. And the players that were in this task force were selected by uh, Parker, Elizabeth Parker. And she was Susan Spalding's boss at the time that she started in CIA. So she was Susan
Right.
Spalding's boss at that time. And now she's circled back. I mean, you got a whole rabbit hole with just her, but she circles back and she attends just about every meeting on this
Well,
task force.
I want to point something out really quick for
Mhm.
our listeners, because I think it's important to understand that pretty much all of the players that we're going to be talking about here today, they all have one thing in common, and what is that?
Intelligence. They are some kind of link to intelligence.
They are lawyers. They are lawyers affiliated with, in some
Oh,
way,
that's
shape,
true.
or form or another, the intelligence agencies or communities.
Hmm. Well,
So,
I'm thinking
Absolutely.
specifically like Admiral Scott Ruston. He's an ASU professor, but he's in the Navy. He does like disinformation campaigns, like over in other countries.
right.
So
So,
let me chime in on that real quick on Scott Ruston. If you look down at the bottom right-hand side of the slide that we're showing right now, he
mhm.
was one of the members that helped establish this committee, right? Arizona State University. I want you to just let this sink in. Director for Center and Narrative, Disinformation, and Strategic Influence. Sounds a
Mhm.
lot like gray zone warfare to me. How to influence society and how to bury information, right? This is all intelligence, kind of third world country operational type stuff, in my
Right.
opinion.
Don't we have a slide on that? I think it was from the McCain Institute that talked about, different types of speech and things of that nature.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to that right here.
Oh, okay, yeah. And so this is directly from the McCain Institute. And people who follow me know that I am no fan of John McCain, because John McCain was nothing more than a war hawk. And I think John McCain was willing to destroy the United States Constitution to maintain, the institution of America. And a lot of what we're seeing taking place here gets sort of to that. But the McCain Institute, they're talking about all of this coordinate the US government response for a new era of Cold War, right? They want the Cold War, folks, and that's exactly what the war in Ukraine is about, to
Mhm.
create and maintain this continued hostility, no longer with the Union Soviet Socialist Republic, because they've gone by the wayside. 1991, the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, the equivalent of NATO for the East, dissolved with a promise from the United States of America and the national security committees or communities in the Western Alliance that we would not expand NATO to the east toward Russia's frontier. We have done nothing but do that since the end of the Cold War and since the USSR disbanded in 1991. And so the United States and the Western intelligence agencies have been technically waging war against Russia ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine is about, pull that slide back up really quickly. The Ukraine is exactly about the national intelligence communities working with their Western allies to continue the Cold War, because what does conflict and war give the intelligence community?
Power. That's how we got the Patriot Act, right?
Fucking
That's
A,
how we
power,
got.
And
power and
that's what
money.
Susan Spalding is all about. I mean, CISA has been about grabbing power
Right. And so this
since
is
its
this is
its inception.
100% about power and the national security state, which really, I mean, if you look at it, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, yeah, they've been doing all of their ops against Russia in Eastern Europe. But really, the national security community has been doing what? It's been, terrorism here, terrorism there, putting out fire here, putting out fire there. But what the intelligence community will not tell you is that when the USSR was fighting in Afghanistan to topple that domino, right? Who were they fighting? Who was one of their primary opponents in Afghanistan? Does anybody know the answer to that question? When the Soviet Union was fighting Afghanistan in the 80s, Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam for the United States. And one of their chief leaders opposing the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden. The
Mm.
United States trained Osama bin Laden in counterinsurgency warfare. We armed Osama bin Laden and
Mhm.
his followers so that they could fight the evil empire, the Union Soviet Socialist Republics, right? All of these terrorists, and the national security state doesn't want you to know this, were created by them on America's behalf to fight the Soviet Union. And so since the Soviet Union collapsed, we've been, pushing NATO to the east toward the Russian frontier. Russia hasn't done anything about it, right? Russia's not interested in a war with the West. They're interested in continuing about their own business, but what happened was all of these people the Soviets trained to counter us, that we trained to counter the Soviets, have now all become terrorists that are in one way or another funded by the United States government, right? And so we have the United States government pushing for this reemergence of a Cold War throughout the world. I think in large part, a lot of it is driven by their need for power, continued relevance, and access to billions of dollars of taxpayers' hard-earned resources. But I think it's also a way to sort of tamp down this international terrorism that has been raging the world since the Soviet Union collapsed, because then they can have their sphere and we'll have our sphere of influence, and we'll keep our people under control and they can keep their people under control. But I don't think the national security institutions of the Western world are or have been prepared to fight this war against terrorism. It's really become more of a war against the American people as as we lose right after right after right in the name of security. And
Well,
so,
and that's what I was going to ask you, Brian, I really see the Cold War that the intelligence community is launching, not so much against terrorism, but more against the populist movement. more against you and I and the freedom loving people, not even just in America, but all across the world who are rising up for their freedoms and liberties and speaking the truth about the government. And so it really concerns me when you see something where it says organizations across the national security community of the United States should consider their efficacy in meeting the disinformation challenge to the West. That is what they are calling the Cold War. This is
Yes.
information uncomfortable to them because we know
Right.
disinformation is synonymous for anything negative about us, right? It's not
Well,
necessarily whether it's true or not.
well,
Well, and here's the go
go
ahead,
up a
Brian.
couple of bullet points. Sorry about that. I'm sorry, but go ahead.
I was going to say the important thing about that is that this report is not like it was written in 2016 or 2018. This was written in 2023. So they're
Right.
continuing to push the narrative. And even right before the elections, Susan Spalding had done education on the judges right before
Right.
2024,
Yeah,
continuing to push that Russia's coming for you. And that's what this whole Cold War thing is about too, is that it's about shutting up the American people. And I think everybody that probably watches you, Brian, knows that
yeah.
that's where we're at. But they have not gotten the message yet that the American people understand that that's where we're at.
No,
And so
I
they
agree
continue to
100%.
push it.
And so, I mean, but if you look at this McCain Institute slide, right, it's very interesting. One thing that We the People USA Alliance does very actively, and its affiliates, is we try to get government records so we can analyze them and produce them to the people. We call that transparency, right? The citizens then have the knowledge they need to be able to make more effective and rational decisions when they go vote, right? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why Stephen Richer got his ass kicked so bad, because We the People brings this transparency that Stephen Richer wants to hide. Stephen Richer actively worked to hide documents. But if you go to this McCain Institute slide, right, I believe it was reported at one time that Stephen Richer was going to go work for the McCain Institute. I'm not sure what happened with that or not. We know now that he works for who's he work with? Who's that big financier? The guy hates America, billionaire. Huh?
Bill Kristol, defending
Norm.
democracy. Is that who you
Oh,
mean?
Norm Eisen, but
Oh,
Norm
Norm
I.
Eisen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he's working with Norm Eisen, and but no, who's the guy? I think he might even be from the Ukraine. He's from Eastern Europe. Billionaire Soros, George Soros. He's working for a Soros affiliated institute. So it's Stephen Richer has actually come out of the closet. But if you look at this slide where it says increased transparency, right? Ensure online political ads have the same transparency and disclosure as traditional media, including public databases and clear disclaimers. What doesn't it say? It doesn't say that we need to ensure that we have transparency in our elections so that the people have faith in those elections as a tool to protect the institution of the United States federal, the state, or the local government, right?
No, they
If you
want
want,
increased transparency from the political groups and
right,
the independent people and the independent media. That's what they're asking for. They're asking for us to be more transparent, not for the government to be more transparent.
right. And our job is to make the government more transparent. That's what we do. And so, none of this McCain Institute has anything to do with it all controlling, restraining, restricting the power of the government to ensure that it engages in behavior that is constitutional and permitted by law, whatever branch of government we're talking to. It all has to do with people in society. They don't like being transparent, right? For example, if I were to put out an episode of What the Fuck is Up, they would probably require me to, have, 100,000 things on there. He's a, pro-Trump. He used to be a Republican. They make me add I'm an extremist or something, and so this is this has nothing to do with controlling or regulating government and making sure it behaves constitutionally, and has everything to do with ensuring that the government doesn't have to behave constitutionally, and that the government is our mama, right? And so
Well,
And it,
look at user validation, guys. Did you guys see that? User validation to implement optional free ID verification to distinguish genuine accounts from fake ones and
right.
enhance trust. So I guess they get to decide somehow. They're going to figure out a way to try and decide what would be considered a genuine account. Like we don't want the government involved in our business. We want the government to show us their business, right? And the McCain Institute, like you said, Brian, it all gears towards protecting the institution. It's very fitting
Right.
that it's the McCain Institute because nothing in any of their objectives are about protecting people's rights, the Constitution, or individual freedoms and liberties, and nothing is about bringing any public transparency to the people from the government.
Right.
and I want to point out that this report from the McCain Institute was actually in conjunction done by the Cronkite Journalism School. So you've got the media, being taught, and the rest of the media, that's where all this comes from. That's where their mindset's at. So it's just one big family, and we're not in it.